My name is Justin Rood. I'm the director of the Congressional Oversight Initiative at the Project on Government Oversight. I'm going to be moderating today's session. For those of you who are familiar with past POGO events and trainings, the rules are all the same. This is open to Hill staff regardless of party, chamber, or position, and includes GAO and CRS. We are nonpartisan and non-hierarchical here. Everyone should ask questions and feel comfortable. Our interest is in making sure that you all get the best information you need to do the best job that you can overseeing the federal government. Today's topic is oversight of federal support for state and local law enforcement. You're going to learn about 3 major federal programs that support local police, the basics of how they work, and how to find out what they're providing law enforcement in your state or district. This is actually part 1 of a 2-part training. Next Thursday at this time, we're going to do a new training on how to drill down into your local police departments to understand what they're actually doing with the equipment and resources that they're being given, and understand the conduct, misconduct picture in your states or districts. That you can register for part 2 of this training. It's again next Thursday at 3:30. There's a link at the bottom of the screen that says register for part 2 of this training. And we'll be putting the link in the chat box, and you'll be getting invitations about it as well. This is also our first offering for the Oversight Summit, our virtual Oversight Summit. The initial summit, the in-person summit was scheduled for this fall, but postponed because of the pandemic. So we'll be doing these virtual events throughout the summer and fall in preparation for hopefully an in-person event in the spring. But we're going to be focusing on some of the real, I think, crisis level issues that the country's and Congress is facing at the moment. We are using Crowdcast. This is a little bit different, so I want to make sure for folks who are used to Zoom and other platforms, you understand how it works. The audience is not going to be on screen. It's only the presenter, so we can't see you or hear you in the audience. There is a chat window that is available to everyone, and it's a fine way to participate and contribute with thoughts and encouragement for your presenters. There is also a function called Ask a Question that you'll see at on the bottom, and that's how we'll be doing the questions for this. Throughout, if you have questions, please use that function to ask. You can also use the chat window, and they'll just move those over to the Ask a Question section. And even if you don't have a question, feel free to look. You may see some, and you can upvote those questions, and that'll make it more likely that we get those answered. Let's see. I've got the platform. Oh, and I also want to let everybody know that this session is going to be recorded and posted online afterwards, but we'll only record the presentation. We're hoping to have 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end, and we will not be posting that. That's all off the record, so feel free. There is no question too small, too big, too complicated, too simple to ask. We want to make sure that you have the information that you need. We'll also be giving you the contact information for the presenters today, so if you have a question following up in the days or weeks ahead, you should feel free to reach out to them. They are here to be resources for you and help in any way they can. So without further ado, I want to get to introducing our speakers. Billy Easley II is a senior policy analyst for Americans for Prosperity. He's on my screen, he's to my right, so I don't know if that's going to work, but I'll try pointing. He's a former aide to Senator Rand Paul, and he's going to be discussing the Department of Justice's Byrne Justice Assistant Grant program, which sends over $250 million to local police agencies annually for equipment, technology, training, and other things. Emily Manna is a policy director for Open the Government, another good government nonprofit group here in DC, who does excellent work, including a recent report on DHS-funded state and local fusion centers. Emily is going to be discussing DHS's Preparedness grant program, which is lesser known, I think, than the Byrne JAG program, but sends much more money to state and local law enforcement through the Preparedness and Homeland Security grant programs, something to a tune of $1 billion a year. And then Wayne McElrath, our POGO ringer and expert on the DoD 1033 program, is going to be talking about I think we can call it a by now infamous program that has transferred hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment to state and local agencies since its inception almost 2 decades ago now, I think. So without further ado, I want to turn the floor over to Billy to explain the Byrne JAG program. Billy?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for all being here. So I'm going to explain the Burn JAG program, why it has such an impact on state and local police departments, why it's important, and how you as congressional staffers can sort of exert your own objectives and goals into this program and engage in effective oversight of the program as well. But first, some background onto this. The Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant JAG program is administered by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the BJA, which is in the Department of Justice. This program is one of the leading sources of federal justice funding to state and local jurisdictions, and also tribal communities as well. The Burn JAG program was created in 2005, and it sort of sells itself as a critical funding necessary to support a range of different programs, activities, and equipment purchases. Now to the big two questions: how much money are we talking about, and what kinds of programs and activities are we talking about? With regards to the money question, we're talking about a pretty large chunk pot of money here. The Burn JAG program in 2019 appropriated over $263 million to state, local, and tribal police departments and law enforcement agencies that year. So this has a huge impact and is regularly used by police departments and other criminal justice authorities. It touches on every aspect of the state criminal justice system. It funds administrative functions. It funds rehabilitation programs like drug courts. It funds crime victim and witness services. But most of this money goes to law enforcement. Often over half of the money annually goes to. In 2016, around 59% of the funding from the Burn JAG program went to law enforcement, which means police cruisers, body armor, body-worn cameras, that sort of thing. So what limitations are there on this type of funding? Honestly, not many limitations at all. The Department of Justice has established that this money can't be used to buy unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, meaning drones and other some such, luxury items, so you can't buy a Mercedes. You can't buy real estate using this funding. And you can't use Burn JAG funding for construction projects unless it involves penal or correctional institutions. But beyond that, the Burn JAG program is very open that if you can find a way to connect it to criminal justice functioning generally, you can apply and you could possibly get a piece of the pie in regards to this funding. Oh, I forgot one last other thing. This has been around since 2005, 2006, so it's not an extremely old program by any means. So how can you gain access to information regarding Burn JAG funding? You're a congressional staffer, and well, I was a congressional staffer for the state of Kentucky. So if I wanted to find this information, I would have to go on the Office of Justice Programs website, look up their state and local solicitations, and I could review it from there. What you'll notice, though, is that if you have the to look at PE's website, the information does not go much farther beyond a statement of the specific allocations that of funding that Burn JAG and DOJ appropriates. That's it. Sometimes it'll just say, you click on like Kentucky, for instance, it'll say Cumberland County received X amount of dollars, and Odessa County received Y amount of dollars. And that's about it. You can dig a little bit further if you go to the Bureau of Justice Assistance website, but it doesn't really break it down how much of the money each county receives by Burn JAG funding, because there are numerous programs that DOJ and BJA use to allocate funds. So one of the things that I want you as congressional staffers to take away from this conversation is that this program has a major impact on the tactics that law enforcement uses, the decisions and allocations that prosecutors or drug courts will use to try to build up trust within communities and try experimental programs. And as a result of that, it's very important that Congress exerts more authority in terms of determining whether or not evidence-based practices are being used so that these programs are being used effectively, and also making sure that the money is being used correctly. The last report that I saw of an analysis by an independent agency determining whether or not this funding was being used correctly, and that funding was that funding that was being allocated met the specific qualifications for funding, was all the way back in like 2012, and that was because when the Recovery Act was passed in 2009, a huge amount of money was given to Burn Jag. I believe it was $2 billion. So the Office of Inspector General of the Department of Justice ensured that there was going to be a report to make sure that all the money that was given out, dotted the I's and crossed the T's, meaning that all that money met the specific qualifications of the Burn Jag program and that it was used for its purpose, its stated purpose. I think that sort of analysis needs to happen more often, and I think that congressional staffers have an important role to play in ensuring that occurs. And one of the many tools that you can use is just quite honestly being engaged with the Department of Justice more often than most offices tend to be. If you contact the Department of Justice's policy team, in my experience when I was on the Hill from 2014 to 2016, they could take a long time to get back to you. They eventually would. And I think what's also important and critical is that if you're going to contact them about the specific Burn Jag allocations that have happened in your state or in a specific locality, and how that was ultimately used, and what Office of Inspector General reports analyses have occurred in regards to that funding, it's important that you ask the right questions. So ensure that you're always asking about your specific state, what types of programs were being funded through Burn Jag. And finally, I think what's really important as well is not just an oversight function, but Congress should be a partner with the Department of Justice in determining which projects, which Burn Jag funding projects are prioritized. So if you go on the Department of Justice's website regarding the Burn Jag program, they have a list of what they call areas of emphasis. These are specific areas that they are going to focus on when they decide which states and localities get the funding. And I'm going to go over just a few of those just so you guys understand it. The Department of Justice says that Burn Jag funding has been directed to emphasize violent crime, fentanyl detection, and the enforcement of firearm laws. Now, that's a decision made by the Department of Justice in consultation with congressional appropriators. And I think it's very important that the determinations of which programs are emphasized and which programs are funded are not decided by the political whims of the Department of Justice, right? What's most important is that Congress and appropriators engage with the Department of Justice and sit down with them annually and determine, all right, what types of programs will taxpayers get the most bang their buck from, right? Is it fentanyl detection? If so, great, let's do that. Is it enforcing firearm law, or is it enforcing laws against child sex offenders, for example, right? This is a give and take conversation, and I think it's one that unfortunately traditionally seems to be determined by DOJ bureaucrats more than congressional members who come to the table and put specific asks on the funding that's being granted to the Department of Justice. So yeah, the two takeaways I want everyone to walk away from here, well, three takeaways, excuse me. Number one, that Burn Jag has a huge impact on the criminal justice system on the state and local level. I know there's been a lot of conversations about policing reform, sentencing reform, and what role the federal government has on it. And by far, one of the biggest ones is the choices we make in regards to what is funded through the Department of Justice. So in any conversation that you guys have about that, Burn Jag should be a part of that conversation. number one. Number two, as congressional staffers, you need to make sure that there's effective oversight of this program. Regularly engage with the Office of Inspector General and the DOJ. Regularly engage with the policy teams at the Department of Justice and with the Bureau of Justice Assistants. If there are specific issues that you think the Bureau of Justice Assistance needs to be funding or prioritizing, be sure to tell them that and speak to them about that, so that when there is an appropriation conversation happening, that they will engage with that and put those emphasis issues into their guiding documents for what specific funding programs they're going to choose to allocate. And I'd be glad to hear from my fellow members on the panel about the important programs that they're also going to discuss, and I'd be glad to take any questions after this event as well.
That's great, Billy. Thank you so much. I want to remind folks of a couple of tips that come up a lot in our trainings for congressional staff. When doing oversight, it should be a normal process to go to the front door of an agency and ask for the documents and information you need and get it. It doesn't always work that way. There are a couple of workarounds. They are not official, but unfortunately, sometimes they yield better results. One is submitting a Freedom of Information Act from your home address, from a staffer's home address. Sometimes it shows up at your home before it's going to show up at your office. The other one is you can use the Congressional Research Service to make requests for information on your behalf, and they don't disclose who's asking for that information. And sometimes you can get faster results through a CRS request data pull than going yourself. So, and I think that information would be relevant to the other two presenters as well. If you have any questions for Billy, please submit them and ask a question. We'll get to them at the end of the presentations, but I want to turn now to Emily. Emily?
Great, thank you, Justin. And yeah, those tips are going to be super helpful for this as well. So I'm going to discuss the DHS Homeland Security Grant Program, which, as Justin mentioned before, gives out quite a lot of money to state and local authorities for fiscal year 2020. That amount has been $1.12 billion, so quite a large program. And the way that those grants are defined by DHS are risk-based grants to aid with preventing, preparing for, protecting against, and responding to acts of terrorism. So the primary stated purpose for those grants is dealing with counterterrorism. They can also be used for natural disaster preparedness and response, as long, again, as there is some kind of nexus to terrorism response and counterterrorism efforts generally. Some of this funding is required to also go through and be attached to state and local authorities' cooperation with fusion centers. And I really want to talk about that as well, because I think it's important in this conversation as we're talking about federal resources for law enforcement authorities, that sometimes those resources are provided to state and local fusion centers rather than directly to local law enforcement. But when you're talking about the types of activities that that fusion centers and law enforcement are both carrying out, especially in terms of things like monitoring protests and other activities like that, they really are working hand in hand. So I think it's important for you all as congressional staffers to consider the resources that are provided and that are channeled through state and local fusion centers as you're considering the resources provided to local police and law enforcement as well. And again, as Justin mentioned, that's where Open the Government kind of comes into the question. We just did a report earlier this year on the DHS Fusion Center network, particularly as kind of a follow-on investigation to a bipartisan Senate investigation from 2012 that Justin, among others, led. And you're going to keep hearing me refer back to that just because the depth and quality of that study really hasn't been replicated since. And that's why I think it's so important that we're having this conversation, is that that report highlighted some serious weaknesses in terms of DHS oversight of the Fusion Center network and of the funding provided, and that this Homeland Security Grant Program is kind of chief among them. And there's still a lot of questions that haven't been answered even in the 8 years since. So I do think that that's a really important part of the conversation, and particularly when things like surveillance technologies are obtained via fusion centers rather than directly through law enforcement agencies, but law enforcement agencies are still utilizing the intelligence gained or the investigative powers of those technologies. So back to the background on those grant programs. They're applied through state administrative agencies. So the state administrative agency applies on behalf of state and local authorities and on behalf of law enforcement and fusion centers. And it's subdivided into 3 categories. There's a state Homeland Security program that's available to all states, an urban areas security initiative, which is available to 33 urban areas that are identified by DHS as being high-risk areas for counterterrorism, and Operation Stone Garden, which is available to border states. And these grants can be used for all kinds of things: training, personnel, all kinds of purposes related to disaster preparedness and counterterrorism. But particularly relevant to this conversation, they can be used for equipment. Now, DHS and specifically FEMA, that's responsible for administering these grants, has an authorized equipment list that provides the examples of what kinds of equipment are actually available to be obtained through these programs. And you can go to FEMA's website and actually search through that list and see what's there. And there are all kinds of, things that you'd expect: personal protective equipment, emergency medical equipment, things like that. But then there are also things like drones, unmanned water vehicles, as well as other types of aircraft, surveillance technologies, tactical body armor, robots that detect and disable IEDs, things like that. And we actually don't, I think, have a full sense of what these grants can be used for, and that's a bit of an issue. One of the examples cited in the Senate report that I was talking about earlier was that one jurisdiction was actually using these grants to pay for rent for the facility they were using for a fusion center, even though that was not technically kind of an improved use of these grants. And DHS okayed it anyway because they saw it as a purpose that was relevant to the goals of the program, even though it wasn't kind of a stated intended purpose of these grants. So it's one reason why I think kind of specific focused oversight on the way these grants are being used in specific jurisdictions is important, because you can't necessarily get a full sense of the uses of these grants just from what the stated intent is from DHS and from FEMA. Now, as far as how you can get information, I'm going to kind of start by just saying how talking about the information that we were able to get just through FOIA and through public records requests, and what we weren't able to get, but what you might be able to get. And effectively, there is some reporting that is required as a part of these grants. First of all, there's something called an investment justification that is required from all applicants to the grant program that states kind of the intended purpose of the way that jurisdictions and states are planning to use this funding. And we were able to obtain that document from a couple of areas, and I'm going to drop a link to one of them in the chat so that you can take a look at it and get a sense of what that looks like. This is from Portland. And it gives a stated kind of purpose and goals for how the funding is going to be used. But if you look through that document, you'll see it's a little bit light on details. And again, that's a document that is required as part of the application process. And there isn't necessarily a real required follow-up that ensures that the funding was actually used in accordance with the commitment that was made in this investment justification document. So it does provide some part of the picture for us, but certainly not the whole picture, and definitely not the whole picture of how the funding was actually used in practice. And that's where I think you all might be able to come in terms of what kinds of documents you may be able to get yourselves. There is something that is called a single audit that must be completed by all state, local, and tribal governments that receive more than $750,000 in federal funding. Although going back to that Senate study, they did find that the kind of precursor to that audit was not super effective or super useful in determining how funds were actually used, because states were a little bit confused oftentimes in terms of how to categorize spending and how to fill those out. But that is a document that you should be able to obtain, but which we were not. There are also audits that FEMA is required to conduct, programmatic and financial reviews of each grantee, and that's required by the Homeland Security Act of 2002, and that's required to be conducted at least every 2 years. However, both a 2012 DHS IG report as well as the 2012 Senate report that I've been talking about, and a follow-up GAO report in 2014 found some kind of major issues in how those reviews were being conducted. Essentially that they were being completed too infrequently and too late to be useful when reviewing current grant applications. In other words, DHS would have to make a decision about whether to renew a state's grant or funding application before those audits had been completed. So they couldn't necessarily use them to complete those audits. And in some cases, recipients would even continue to receive grants despite multiple years of DHS assessing that they had made zero progress towards milestone goals. Some issues in the way that DHS is conducting those audits and assuring that funds and funding and grants are being used effectively. But again, if you take the investment justification, if you take the single audit and you take the FEMA biennial reviews and put them together, you probably can come up with a little bit better of a picture of how these grants are actually being used in the specific jurisdiction, even if each of those kind of pieces of reviews are not super effective in and of themselves. I also just finally, real quick, did want to just mention something about, again, that kind of connection and collaboration between state and local law enforcement and fusion centers, because I do think that the surveillance technologies and investigative technologies is not something we talk about as much when we're talking about militarization of law enforcement and related issues, but it's an important thing, and that's a big issue when it comes to these types of counterterrorism programming and grants in particular. We do know that fusion centers and hundreds of police departments are using, facial recognition technology, even when that technology is found to be inaccurate or ineffective. And even though fusion centers are actually not meant to have investigative capabilities themselves, we don't know whether these grants in particular are being used to purchase that technology. But like I was saying before, we don't have 100% clear sense of how these grants are being used and what they're being used for in every situation. So, that's one reason why it is important, again, to drill down on kind of those local jurisdictions. And, while there are kind kind of annual privacy audits that fusion centers are required to undergo. In many cases, our research found that effectively those tend to kind of be rubber stamped in the sense that basically every activity that a fusion center requests or reports on doing is approved by DHS. They're virtually never not approved by DHS. And in some cases that was occurring even though the fusion center or the locality or jurisdiction in question did not have a required privacy policy in place. We found that in Chicago and found that in a few other places, that they were using surveillance technologies, including facial recognition technology, without privacy policies in place. So this is just another area that I think it's really important to figure out exactly how federal funds are being used. And whether, federal requirements for funding, including requirements for privacy policies and civil liberties protections, are being upheld. And in a serious way, that's not just, that's not simply a rubber stamp. So that's a lot of information. I apologize. There's lots more, but I'm happy to, again, answer questions once all is said and done here.
Emily, thank you so much. I just want to add a couple things, and a lot of my information is old because I did work on this back in 2012, 2013, and some processes have changed. Some things haven't, though, and I think one thing, Emily, I think you mentioned this was these grants are to some degree formula based, and I think that's also true. Is that true for JAG as well, or is there an aspect of JAG that's formula based? So for those of you who are familiar with federal grant programs, that you know what that means. I did not. I always thought of grants as a process where you asked for money, and if you had made a really good case, they gave it to you. And formula grants work the opposite. And I think one of the things that we've demonstrated is that's not a great setup. When I say it's the opposite, I mean the state knows how much money they're getting before they've written a single word to explain what they're going to do with it. And the incentive for the agency, whether it's DOJ or FEMA or DHS, is to get that money out the door. And I guarantee you that the phone calls that they get from Congress and the oversight that they've gotten from Congress has focused almost entirely on, why does my state or locality not have the money that they're supposed to get from you? So the entire system is developed to get money out the door. It's not created to stop the money from going out the door. And one of the things that we found back then and that Emily's found more recently is that it's almost impossible to make a case to lose your money, regardless of what you do with this. And that's part of what's so crazy about it. I think there is a big mystery about how the money is being spent. It's a giant pot of money. More often than not, when we did the hard work of really digging down to the local level and finding out, what the money was being spent for was essentially to cover costs that needed to get covered. It wasn't really augmenting, which is what the money's supposed to be for. It was supplanting, and almost every one of these grant programs has language that the federal dollars are not supposed to supplant state and local spending. But again, there's no penalty if you don't. So, I mean, I think the level of misconduct within the grant programs, coupled with the lack of oversight, I think makes it a pretty happy hunting ground for congressional investigators and oversight staff. Also, one really good thing to know, dig into that. The equipment list, the AEL, the authorized equipment list that Emily mentioned, is available online. You just Google FEMA AEL equipment list and you can see it. But it's a horrible document. I've had to swim through it myself. They do have certain weird prohibitions. UAVs, I think, came up. Tactical body armor is not supposed to be used for crowd control. It's only supposed to be used for essentially bum rushing houses, for doing your I don't know, there's warrant service. I don't know what they're supposed to be doing with this stuff that's a federal interest, but they're not supposed to be using it for crowd control. And I think that what we probably saw in all of those photographs of the last few weeks of cops out lining up against protesters was a lot of federally funded equipment that was being used improperly, because I guarantee you they're not keeping 2 sets of riot control gear. That all being said, and Emily, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. Wayne, let's hear, I think, what so many folks know so well, starting from Ferguson and before, about the DoD 1033 program.
In some people's minds or perception, changed the complexion of our police departments nationally. Started in the 1990s as a part of an NDAA, the purpose of the 1033 program was to provide equipment to police departments for counter narcotics and counterterrorism operations. Over the years, we've noticed that the equipment that has been requested from the Department of Defense through DLA of demilitarized items tend to trend more towards controlled items versus non-controlled items. When I say controlled items, I mean firearms, bayonets, mine-resistant vehicles, those type of equipment that have bring a lot of attention. But the non-controlled items are computers, photocopiers, things that these departments can use also that maybe they can't afford to pay for through their normal everyday budget. So you have controlled items and you have non-controlled items. So having these two pots of equipment has been of congressional interest for quite a while. And they've asked the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, to conduct a couple of studies relative to this particular program. Back in 2006, my team actually went out and we looked at this program relative to controlled items to see if regular individuals or normal citizens can get controlled items that they weren't entitled to or shouldn't be able to get from the program. And through that study, and several recommendations were made, showed that our investigators using off-the-shelf or commercially available documentation were able to go in and actually obtain these particular items from the DLA. Now, in 2017, which we actually commenced the work in 2016, we did a similar look at the DLA 1033 program and actually identified significant controls issues relative to the controls associated with equipment, specifically controlled items that were going to federal organizations. And I'm going to step back for just a little bit and explain the fact that within the 1033 program, we have a federal program and we have a state program. The state program is, each state has its own what's known as a law enforcement support office coordinator. And those coordinators are assigned to every state that would like equipment to the tune of about 8,000 police departments, roughly. And then you have the federal program. And the federal program, there's several federal agencies who have gotten equipment from DLA. Now, as a part of our controls study relative to the federal side of the DLA program, we actually created a false or fictitious police department and actually went out and submitted justifications to the we received authorization to join the program as a fake police department and then submitted justifications for control items to be obtained from the DLA. And we were successful in both. So we showed that there were a lot of deficiencies in controls that you as congressional officials should be looking at as this issue continues to come to the fore, where citizens and political figures are more concerned about the shape and complexion of our police departments overall. Getting information relative to the 1033 program can be accomplished by any number of ways that Justin mentioned, but also on the DLA website, they have a complete listing of all the items that are available that have been sent to states and what their approximate real dollar value cost was. Now, you have to be mindful that it's a huge spreadsheet, and some of the dollar figures that you'll see will be the actual amount that was paid for the items at the time of requisition or being acquired. Then there's the demilitarized cost, the cost that after it's been utilized that they actually offer to other organizations for use. So when you're looking at the spreadsheet that's online with DLA, be mindful of the fact that there's the different dollar figures that you will see reflect two different cost points at acquisition and then also at DMIL. when we are looking at this program relative to the acquisition of the actual items, once the local police department actually submits a justification to DLA, DLA will take a look at the justification and send those items through the state coordinator or directly through DLA's federal coordinator to the department. Now, the DLA will not actually ship these items. What they will do is they will send it, or it'll be maintained at one of their centers, in which the police departments will actually go out and actually pick those items up from the facility and then take it back to their particular organizations or agency for actual use. So from a accountability standpoint, you have Congress who's taken several occasions to have the GAO take a look at it, and then you have your Inspector General's office that has taken a look at some of these particular programs. Then you have, from the perspective of the, I'm losing my train of thought here. You have the perspective from the lesser coordinators, where they're actually receiving these items, but in the grand scheme of things, no one is really taking account into how the items that they actually receive are being utilized once they're obtained. They're receiving any number of items based on justifications that are generated by the police departments within those particular agencies without any type of community control. The chief or the firearms coordinator or whoever who's the oversight individual for that particular program will create a justification and submit it to DLA. DLA will fulfill that justification and send it to the organization through one of its distribution centers. But no one is really speaking to or looking at how this equipment is being used once it's actually in their inventories, which speaks to mission creep, where items that were intended to be used for counter narcotics and counter terrorism may now bleed over and be used towards crowd control, for demonstrations and issues like that, and may be seen by the public as, instead of facilitating the expression of First Amendment rights, but by the police department rolling out MRAPs and these other types of gears, could further intimidate the public from availing themselves of their First Amendment rights. As I stated before, there's any number of ways to get at information relative to what's going out. The DLA has that information on its particular website, and also has a complete listing, and they keep it pretty current, of each and every lesser coordinator around the country. What I didn't see when I went out and looked at the website was the coordinators for the federal side of the particular program, which, front door process, you should be able to go to this organization and actually get that information directly from them. But what would be useful in a lot of instances is performing a compare and contrast. See what the DLA gives you on their particular website, and then contact those police departments who may be receiving grants or other types of federal funds, where you can actually go out and get that information and perform your own comparison. What's woefully deficient is the fact that you can't really tell how this equipment is being used overall.
Wayne, that's great. Thank you very much. I had a question for you regarding the 1033 program. I know that sometimes the pushback on criticism of the program is, even though it's coming from DoD, the vast majority of equipment that's being transferred is surplus snow shovels and clipboards and things that would not be considered to be militarizing. What would your response to that be?
Access to the program is the issue, and then not so much what's being obtained. There are certain administrative items that are being received, clipboards, snow plows, and things like that. Those are non-controlled items, which, given that they're a police department, why you would need a snow plow when you have, those items should be controlled by other city departments, not the police department. Then you have those controlled items. once they have access, once police departments have access to this particular program, they can request anything off of those lists as long as they have a properly formatted justification that passed musters. As I stated, we created a police department out of whole cloth. Our justification had no real components to it at all. We didn't have any police officers. We didn't have any, SWAT team. We didn't have a real law enforcement mission. We even made up a statute of law that our organization fell under, and we still received those items. So although the non-controlled items don't have a one-to-one relationship as far as the militarization is concerned, it's having access to the program and the justifications that are being written by those law enforcement entities that should be brought under further scrutiny or into question.
You brought up a really interesting point, and it was the first time I'd heard it today in context of these programs. But SWAT teams, I think, are something that I'm almost 50 years old, and I feel like SWAT teams have been around since forever. And
Right.
It wasn't until I started talking with policing organizations that I realized not only that there's a relatively new phenomenon, but that the propagation of SWAT teams as these kind of special ops, highly armored, highly aggressive teams. There are many more of them than a lot of policing experts, former police and chiefs think are necessary. And the number of SWAT teams that are at the federal level, some of the agencies having SWAT teams that you kind of wonder why they need them. But so much of that, that is a case of augmentation. So much of the augmentation in these police departments happens because of the federal dollars. All these cool toys, facial recognition, whatever the toy of the day or the year is. More often than not, the local budgets are not going to be able to cover that stuff, and it's the feds who are buying it for them. So, unfortunately, I think as our presenters have done a great job explaining, the oversight to make sure that those don't get misused is almost non-existent, to the point where the federal government, I think it would be fair to say the federal government is essentially creating a tacit policy of violence without conducting the oversight to ensure that it wasn't improperly used or used against Americans.
Justin, SWAT teams actually came about in California, which was one of the first states to come up with SWAT teams. And since that particular point and the implementation of the 1033 program, we've seen like 1,000% increase in the number of SWAT teams or police departments that are actually willing to dedicate officers and create justifications to create these teams. Now, I'm not saying that each and every community either does or does not need a SWAT team, but where are these smaller communities getting the budgets to be able to afford this equipment? The vast majority of them don't have that budget available. But what they do have is the 1033 program, where they can go out and get specialized equipment free of charge. All they have to do is create a justification. Now, as I stated before, the police chief or the firearms instructor or the tactical coordinator may be the individual who's creating the justification for this particular function within the police department. But that does not include or may not include any community input relative to whether or not that function is needed. And then also the DLA or the 1033 program does not require any type of hard data that would give the organization an indication that there is an actual need for that level of equipment within local police departments. If you've never had a hostage situation, why are you going out and procuring from the 1033 program a dozen rifles, grenade launchers, bayonets, which have no community policing function at all? But it's pretty much allows, police departments to have a wish list of, toys that they can go out and just obtain without any of the penalties. Penalties in the sense that without the oversight or having to produce the funding for it. And we've noted over the years, police departments who have gotten equipment that they can't maintain, that the military has a hard time maintaining a military occupational specialty to be able to maintain it. but a local police department will go out and get that piece of equipment, and they don't have the specialized skills to be able to operate or maintain it. So now for that community that's now acquired an MRAP that needs specialized equipment and mechanical skills and abilities, now they have to bear the cost of what a police chief or a tactical coordinator went out and obtained, especially if they plan on using it at some point. The question for me is, in a lot of instances, is there any data to support the need for you to go out and get this type of equipment? And then we have the other more compounding issue, the fact that some of the equipment that ends up in DLA's repositories or the 1033 program's repository has never been used. So, which speaks to the surplus relative to military items. You're purchasing so much that it creates this huge surplus that goes where? And we're seeing that bleed into our policing, because now we have a cache of cool toys for people to play with. And anytime you give someone a toy, and we see this in the military, and we call them toys in the generic sense, but you give them these items, they will figure out a way to use them.
You have to justify having them.
Exactly.
And to the point, Justin, that you were making earlier, related to there being no kind of mechanism to stop this funding from going out, there's actually a question right on the FAQ page for applicants for the Homeland Security Grant Program that says, if my program is found to be ineffective, will I lose my funding? And DHS says, no. You can't get expanded funding next year, but you may get the same level of funding, and we'll just work with you to see what happened and see if there's a way to make things effective. But it really is as clear a signal as possible to states that even if your program doesn't work and is ineffective, nothing's really going to happen to the level of funding that you're receiving.
I remember now going back and forth with FEMA with the simple question, have you ever cut anybody off? Like, has anybody ever been shut down from access to your grant money because they were just so bad with it? And they said, oh yes, absolutely. It happens all the time. We'll get you a list. And several months later, it was, the list had a grand total of one name on it. It was one of the territories. I don't remember which one it was. And it was like, I mean, it was one of these situations where like they hadn't even submitted paper, like there was no paperwork whatsoever. There's just no way, which was like more of an administrative challenge of administering the grant. I can't remember the whole situation, but yes, it was striking in that regard. Oh, I was laughing. I wanted to apologize. Bayonets aren't funny, and nothing about this is funny, but I was laughing when you mentioned them because I helped organize the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee hearing on the 1033 program back in 2014. Billy is smiling and nodding because I think he might have written the question. Senator Paul came to the hearing. Well, when it was well underway, we'd already been past opening statements, and I was getting nervous he was going to show up at all. I was working for Tom Coburn, the ranking member. And just a couple minutes before his question time came, he swept into the room, sat down, and said, I just want to know about the bayonets. And that became the lead on the New York Times story about the hearing the next day. Taught me a lot about what he's good at. So yes, that was very impressive. Anyway, it was a great hearing. Go back and watch it, or you can read the stories. It was a good hearing. We don't have any questions from the audience, and I don't want to belabor the point here about the lack of accountability, but I do want to say that this is actually a really good moment to start looking at some of this stuff. Not only because obviously the world has created a moment where not only the focus of so many Americans, but people around the world are focused on issues of police misconduct and official violence here in the United States, but as well, we're going through, I think, what's going to be an incredibly challenging economic time. And that's going to hit all of these cities and states very, very hard, when that means that all of this federal funding from all sources is going to be more important to them than ever. So I think that you're entering an environment in which some of the states and localities that you may be looking at are going to be more willing to cooperate with some of your questions, And they may also be more willing to adapt some of their policies and practices to stay in whatever compliance regime you guys might want to create. That's assuming you want to keep the programs there. I know there are proposals to shut down programs like the 1033 program as well, and that's certainly a credible avenue of reform as well. Before I say thank you guys for participating in this, I wanted to just do a last quick check. If there are any last thoughts that anybody wanted to give, Billy, since you went first, I want to start with you.
Yeah, the last thing I would just make sure everyone sort of takes away from this is not only your role as congressional staffers in terms of being able to push for oversight and making sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent appropriately to these programs, but also think deeply about the accountability measures, right? About how it looks when state and local programs are getting funding without being vetted appropriately for how that funding is being spent. The 1033 program is one of the biggest examples of this, I think, because it is directly a matter of seeing pictures of people with MRAPs in local and rural counties, right, where people look at that sort of spending and look at that sort of appropriation in terms of items and think to themselves, well, what was the purpose of that? And it should be the job of all congressional staffers and congressional members, mind you, to think that way about all spending generally, right, about how we are spending things. And the other thing I will note here is the impact that this has right now on cutting edge technology issues. Emily mentioned facial recognition. The burn jab program has specific standards for body worn camera programs, right? It says that for most of its programs, if you want to put in for an item, if you want to put in for allocation for funding, you don't really need to put too much information about what you're going to use that funding for. But there's an exception with body-worn cameras, and it specifically says that your organization needs to have a policy about how you retain that data, about how you use data taken from body-worn cameras and issues like that. It says nothing about facial recognition policy. And I think it's really important that as this technology gets deployed more often in different communities and through federal funding, that congressional staffers in the Department of Justice ask themselves, hey, if this is going to be spent and this technology is going to be acquired through federal dollars, we need to make sure that there's some standard of practice about how it's being used and when it's being used. So always think ahead about how cutting edge technology is being supported by federal dollars and what role Congress and the Department of Justice has to play to ensure that it's being used in a way that enhances community policing and protects individual rights.
That's great. Thank you, Billy. Emily, what about you?
Yeah, this isn't so much an addition, but I wanted to echo Billy's request that I guess you dig deeply on the oversight aspect of this. I mentioned when I was speaking earlier that there was a 2012 DHS IG report that found very little oversight of these grants. And there was a 2017 follow-up to that in which the IG's office found that, previously FEMA just didn't have any real system for tracking the effectiveness of these grants. And the 2017 report found that FEMA had implemented a system. And so they made no further recommendations. And, I think when we look at that, or we look at these privacy audits that, are being approved every time, it has to go a little bit deeper than just seeing whether a box was checked and looking to see if whether there is ever actually any accountability for misuse, of any of this equipment. It defies logic. It defies reason to think that this equipment has never been misused, has never been used inappropriately, has never been ineffective enough to pull funding. So if you're just seeing boxes being checked, to ask you again to just go deeper and really, look for yourself as to how that equipment is being used and whether it's appropriate.
That's great. Thank you. Wayne. Oh, we've got a mute issue here. Oh, we got you.
Okay. It looks like we've arrived at a point where the supply has driven the demand, where departments are actually requesting items, not because there's a real need, but because it's there. And from a governmental standpoint, we're always looking at the fact, can we account for it? Yes, we can account for it. We can say who received it and where it is. But the real question is, how is it being used? And overwhelmingly, it's beginning to become clear it's being used in a fashion that is not supportive of individual rights. And that I think is where congressional officials such as yourself really need to press. And then also the fact that attempting to maintain these items that they've requested without justification, the burdens, the economic burdens that is putting on those communities through extra tactics and time and resources, because they've obtained items that they really didn't need in the first place. All of these requests need to be supported by data and real examples of a need, as opposed to a police officer or a police department or a police chief sitting in their lone office and saying, oh, that's cool, I would like one of those. And I think even in our case with our fake police department, that's exactly what we did. We said, that looks cool, I like one of those. And we were able to obtain it. So with that, I wish you guys the best in your time on the Hill, and that you take some real time and energy to root out how these items are being used.
That's great, Wayne. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our presenters. It's a real honor to be able to share a screen with you. And I would just want to remind folks that we will be posting this video and letting you know. We will also be sharing contact information for all the experts that you've heard from today. And if you do move forward in looking into any of these things, they stand ready to help you. Thank you so much. Thank you to our dedicated production team of making this possible. And thanks to everybody who joined us. Have a fantastic and safe 4th of July weekend. I hope everybody's seen the video on improper use of fireworks. If you haven't, look it up. And enjoy yourselves. And thank you.